Richard Schwadel is the editor of Lucky Hank, the AMC comedy. I'm at Noble Gold Derby. Want to kick things off by asking you, Richard, what is the most challenging thing about editing Lucky Hank?
Oh boy. um, I'd say probably that he's not a super likable character. It's the show is based on Richard Russo's novel Straight Man, and in that book, it was written all in first person, and it was sort of like you were so much into his head, and he was pretty much a bastard to everybody except his wife. And obviously, the producers couldn't do a show like that and have people follow it, so they reworked the show, but still kept. He had to have that edge, and I think that was a tough. Um, it's a tough nut to crack to have an anti-hero who isn't super likable, especially in the first episode. Like in the beginning, he eviscerates a student's work after being begged to comment on it and avoiding it. So that was difficult. And Bob Odenkirk is such an amazing actor. He, you know, just a look, just a grunt says so much. So for me, it was a challenge to make sure he was likable, but keep that edge to his character.
Mm. Like, I guess as an editor, when there are those little moments where it's a little grunt or a little whatever that Bob or someone does, like, is it a challenge in choosing when to like how much to not focus on that too much and let that breathe and or sort of like, but you don't want it to get ignored at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, you have to use them sparingly, and unless it's a scene where the person doesn't talk much, like Keanu Reeves and John Wick. uh, but there, in particular, I would say a good example would be in the very opening scene of the pilot. There's a moment where the student Barto is kind of begging him to comment on his story, and Odenkirk's trying to blow him off. Um, and finally, I cut to his close up, and he just stares the kid down and does a little head shake and makes this grunt. And it said so much about who this man is that I just had to use that shot, and it stayed in from the get go.
Mm.
So yeah.
Yeah, and we've got like the show juggles different tones, like very funny comedy at times, but also we're dealing with someone's midlife crisis and some real dark sort of thoughts and things that are happening. How do you, as an editor, approach those different tones the show's dealing with?
Yeah, dramedies are tricky. You're changing gears, and it for me, what I do is I make sure I know the script inside and out. If there's any dialogue that I'm not sure I understand, I'll ask. In this case, Pete Farrelly. What does this line mean? Like, what does it really mean? What's the subtext here? Um, and then it's a matter of before I start the dailies, I just reread the scene again, make sure I've got the scene in my head, and then I just let the tone of the dailies speak to me. And so I think, uh, you know, it's all in the writing and obviously the acting. So typically I'm not changing the tone, you know, if it goes from a really laugh out loud scene to a scene that then goes a little bit dark, you know, that's how it's on the page. So for me, tonally, I think it's just sort of you're like riding a wave, and for me, it's always about keeping the moments real and not trying to force the comedic parts and not trying to force the dramatic parts. It's letting the story evolve. So I would say there's no particular trick to it, but that's sort of how I work with it.
And it's like you don't like approach a dramatic or a comedic scene that differently as an editor, or do
Well,
you?
there's sort of different techniques you use. Like a comedic scene. For instance, the first time he's in the pilot, the first time he's voted out as chair, um, there's a lot of people in the room, and there's all this other stuff going on. They get into these little arguments about rules, minutiae, and stuff. So that's cut in a comedic way where we're using reactions of people. He's rolling his eyes while all of his colleagues are arguing about, the process. Um, then if you're in a scene with, him and his wife, it just things slow down, I think, you know, when it goes more dramatic. So obviously less cuts, less cutty, um, letting moments play out more,
Hmm.
letting moments land too in
Hmm.
the more dramatic scenes.
Hmm. You've got so you edited the first two episodes of the series. I think you've also edited episode 107 that hasn't aired yet.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about that second episode, George Saunders, which has the great moment at the end where and Bob and Brian Husky are having this back and forth and exchange. What was it like to cut that scene together?
That was a toughie. That was really difficult. Yeah. Are you going to play it or should I set it up?
So, give us a little bit of a context. I'm not going to play it. So,
Okay. Okay. So that episode is about the real author played by Brian is George Saunders, who's a very famous short story novelist. Um, he and Hank had published their first books at the same time, and over the course of their careers, Saunders skyrocketed, and Hank ended up as an English professor in a mediocre university. So he's got a big chip on his shoulders, and Saunders comes to visit and lecture at Hank's college, and all the while throughout the whole episode, there's just this boulder on his shoulder of George Saunders. Even though Saunders is being pretty nice to him throughout the episode, there's a few things he says that sets him off, but overall he's been nice and respectful, and Hank is just going crazy. And so uh, towards the end of the episode, Hank has to interview him on stage in front of a pretty large audience. And at first, he bails right before he's supposed to do it, and he leaves, and he ends up meeting up with a friend, and they talk, and the friend sort of talks him into doing it, and going back and standing up. So he tears off and goes back and confronts Saunders backstage, and Saunders was like, first of all, surprised that he came back, but also now surprised, why is this guy sort of attacking me? And so it was, there's a lot of things at play. There's the dean who's doing this very long introduction on stage while Hank and George are backstage having this very intimate conversation. And Hank is telling him, face it, you never liked my work, you thought I was a terrible writer. And Saunders ends up telling him, I actually reread your book last night and it's fantastic. I never said that I didn't like it. And there was some misunderstanding. And he finally tells him, your book was amazing. I loved your book. At that moment, the dean introduces them, and Saunders walks on stage, and Hank is stunned by what Saunders just told him backstage. Then he has to come out and interview him, and he's totally off balance now, and stutters during the interview, and finally gets his mojo, and it turns into a montage, and they kind of hit it off in the montage, and they get the audience behind them, and everybody's cheering. So there were so many elements to that. The backstage stuff was pretty simple in terms of how it was covered, but again, keeping all the balls in the air, like understanding what was happening on stage and sort of letting the audience know that they were about to be introduced, but he was giving them all this amazing information that is blowing Hank away. That oh my God, he liked my work, and probably the most difficult part of that was the actual montage itself because they did a lot of free form questions and answers. And so I probably had, I don't know, 25, 35 minutes of them just talking about stuff that wasn't scripted. Peter threw out stuff to him and said, talk about so and so, now do this, now do that. So there were all these different um, emotions and topics and things that they were talking about. And when I first looked at it, I was going, well, what am I going to do here? If it's just a montage, it's then just smiling faces, and how does that work? And eventually, like when I did my editor's cut, I was never really happy with how it turned out. It was one of those scenes. Sometimes, rarely, I'll do a scene, I'll do it four different ways, and I still won't feel like I got it. And so when I turned it over to Pete, I said, I don't think I've got this scene, and he was pretty happy with it, but we still reworked it. It got reworked again with Aaron and Paul, the showrunners, and I think ultimately they made it really good because what they decided to do was leak out little bits of words in the mix of what is being said, but not everything. So it's a combination of the music driven and dialogue driven, and sort of builds and builds and builds. And at the end, he says, ladies and gentlemen, George Saunders and Hank Devereaux, and everybody cheers. And so it feels like it's a victorious moment for him, I think.
Mm. And that's the episode you'll be choosing to submit for the Emmys, I believe,
Yes.
for
Yeah.
editing this year. Is that scene why you chose that episode?
I think it felt to me like that episode just was a little bit more had a little more gravitas and more emotional than the pilot. Pilot episodes, you have to introduce everybody, and you have to introduce the world. And I think it's a great episode, and I was really torn. And then I thought also, in terms of the actual editing, there's probably some more interesting editing in 102 than 101. Like there's stuff at the beginning where he's looking at the computer. There's that montage. There's a scene that I still laugh at today in the restaurant where his daughter and her husband are Hank and Lily think that they're about to break news that they're having a baby, that she's pregnant, and so there's this very expectant scene, and they're really nice to them, and the the husband is saying, yeah, there's he's dancing around the subject, and Hank's getting a little impatient, and then finally it turns out that they're building a pool, but the build up to it is so well done, and I just love that scene. And then Peter, in terms of how he shot it, he had an inside angle. Everything was shot from the outside, like two shots overs and then close-ups. But then he did this specific angle where it was inside the actors and almost to camera, where both people in two shot were looking into camera. And it was really tricky finding when to use that because it didn't feel like as soon as I went in, I could go back out from that angle. And I think we found the perfect place to use it. And once again, Bob is, if you look at his expression, it is so funny while this kid's explaining all about this great pool they're building, and you can just see him sinking and getting really like dark looking at this kid. It's pretty good. It's pretty funny.
Like, And with editing on this show, like, perspective is an interesting thing because it is like sort of Hank's perspective through which we see everything. There's narration from him, and like this show's very much from his perspective. So is it hard as an editor, or like how do you approach when you have to show things from different people's perspectives outside of Hank's and choosing when to sort of do that?
Yeah, I think um, we're pretty much in his head
Mm,
and his perspective throughout the series.
mm,
There's a few places where, well, I shouldn't say the whole series because
mm.
every episode is quite different. Like the arc of the series, we were talking tone earlier, right? The tone
Yeah.
changes a lot. It gets a lot more dramatic. But I think it's mostly the way it was shot is we're with Bob. Occasionally, we're with Lily too. Um,
Mm,
there's a scene in the pilot where we introduce her workplace, and she's smoothing out an argument between a teacher and a parent, and you know we're obviously with her and not them in that scene. But usually, I would say we're with Bob, we're with Hank. Again,
yeah.
staying somewhat true to the book.
Mm. What Richard, what makes good editing? Like,
That it's invisible.
mm,
You shouldn't notice good editing,
yeah.
and it's weird because as an editor, I'm always noticing it. But I've been watching Beef, for instance. I
Mm,
just finished it last night. Have you seen
yeah.
it?
No, I haven't seen that one yet.
Oh my God, it's an amazing show.
Oh,
It really is. And the last episode was cut so well that I was noticing stuff, and usually I don't go, "Oh, look, there's a close up," or why did they go to that there? But it was so creative and so well done that it jumped out to me, but in a good way. So, other editors probably feel the same way, like they notice when things are really well done. But I would say the average viewer, what you shouldn't notice, you should feel like, I use the word evolve, like this, like the show is evolving, not like we're trying to force something into a box. Like if you have a scene that's not playing as a comedy and you try and make it a comedy and you're forcing
mm,
cuts, that
yeah.
jumps out. But it should just feel natural and invisible. Like you shouldn't be able to notice good editing, I think.
Mm. Which makes it so hard, like talking about it in an awards context where people are having to sort of vote for the ones they think are the best and all that sort of stuff. Because
Yeah.
great editing is hard to see because it's a bit, you're not thinking about the editing when you're watching a great show.
But I think, when it comes to peers, they're looking at stuff
Yeah,
differently.
yeah, and the
You know,
great
like,
thing, yeah, and the great thing with the Emmys as opposed to the Oscars is that even for nominations and winners, you just have editors
right,
voting. Yeah.
right. Yeah. I wish I knew more editors in LA.
Yeah.
Work that campaign.
Was there something that you watched when you were younger before you got into editing that made you want to get into editing a particular film or show?
I always, I got mainly interested in it in university where
Mhm,
it was a point where I just learned that um, it's a version of storytelling.
mm,
You're essentially retelling a story, and everybody knows the thing about three different movies. The script, the production, and then the editing. Um, but it's you're given a chance to rework the script to make the script better. I work with a lot of writers, showrunners, and they're not precious about their work. They're willing to move scenes around if it's not working in a particular place, or if they think it's better. And
mm,
and I think that's what really interested me. It's a really cool form of storytelling, and I love music. So add the fact that we score and we get to choose our own temp score, and there's a lot of elements to editing that I find very creative and fun.
And just quickly to finish off, Richard, what do you love most about Lucky Hank?
Ooh. The cast.
I
I
guess.
think I think the cast is just stellar. Suzanne Cryer is amazing. Muriel Enos is amazing. The woman who plays Emma, Shannon DeVito, is hysterical. They're everybody just really gelled well and pretty quickly for an 8 episode series.
Mm.
It was such a treat to watch dailies and put scenes together that just made me laugh or made me cry too in places. Um, and that's a real unique talent to be able to put a cast together like that on a show like this, I think. And kudos to all the producers who did that, because I think they really stand out.
Well, Richard, all the best for the upcoming Emmy Awards. Hopefully, some of those editors down in LA check out Lucky Hank, and all the best for everything else with the series as it comes along. People watching this interview can go to goldderby.com to watch other interviews and get in on the awards discussion. And Richard, also just thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Hey, thank you, Matt. Appreciate the interview.